The Russian Navy made one fatal mistake in the winter of 2026. They believed the map. They assumed that geography was a shield deep in the Arctic, far from the blood-soaked trenches of the Donbass and the drone-infested waters of the Black Sea. The Admiral Grigorovich-class frigate cut through the slushy waters off East Greenland. To the Kremlin, this was the Green Zone, a strategically uncontested region where their most expensive naval assets could operate without the constant fear of a sudden, fiery end. The crew on the bridge wasn't worried about asymmetric threats. They were worried about the cold. The ship's sensors were calibrated for the ghosts of the Cold War, scanning the depths for American Virginia-class subs or British astute boats that occasionally played hide-and-seek under the ice caps. They believed that by putting 4,000 miles between themselves and the Ukrainian coastline, they had bought themselves safety. But safety in modern warfare is a psychological trap. While the Russian sailors sipped tea in the heated mess hall, the ship's radar was giving them a clean bill of health. No NATO destroyers were on the horizon, no carrier strike groups were within 500 miles, and the airspace was theoretically empty. From a conventional naval perspective, the frigate was a king in a wasteland. However, they were operating on an obsolete doctrine. They didn't realize that the front line had become a global concept. The Arctic wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. The assumption was simple. Ukraine doesn't have a blue water navy, so they can't reach us here. It was a logical conclusion that ignored the terrifying reality of the new math of war. As the 4,000-ton warship plowed through the freezing fog at 28 knots, it was already being watched, not from the sky and not from the deep, but from the very surface of the water they thought they owned. The hunters weren't coming from a naval base. They were already there, waiting in the dark. The true genius of the operation didn't lie in the drones themselves, but in how they arrived. Thousands of miles from any Ukrainian port, two nondescript, rusted commercial aid containers were drifting aimlessly in the Arctic currents. To a passing observer or a cursory radar sweep, they looked like maritime trash, lost cargo from a container ship that had succumbed to the brutal North Atlantic swells. In reality, these were Trojan horses of the digital age. Ukrainian special operations teams had spent months perfecting the conversion of these steel boxes into stabilized, climate-controlled, and remotely activated launch bays. Internally, they were a masterpiece of improvised engineering, fitted with shock absorbers to protect the delicate electronics of the Magura V5 drones from the violent tossing of the sea. These containers didn't just carry weapons, they carried a message. They had been dropped off weeks earlier by a dark commercial vessel, a ship with its transponders off, blending into the thousands of other merchant craft that crisscrossed the globe. This was the ultimate middle finger to Russian intelligence. While Moscow's satellites were busy tracking Ukrainian troop movements in the east, they completely missed a pair of shipping containers being dumped into the Arctic. These boxes sat passively, bobbing in the freezing slush, their internal batteries keeping the drone systems in a low-power sleep mode. They waited for a specific acoustic signature, a unique vibration in the water that matched the turbines of an Admiral Grigorovich-class frigate. When that signature hit the external hydrophones, the containers didn't just open, they came alive. The drones didn't need a runway or a crane. The sides of the containers blew outward with small explosive bolts, and the Magura V5s slid into the water like sharks being released into a feeding frenzy. The Russian crew never saw the launch. They were too busy looking for missiles to notice the trash behind them had suddenly started breathing. The attack protocol wasn't a blind swarm. It was a choreographed execution. The two Magura V5s immediately separated, taking up a formation that was as much about psychology as it was about tactics. They maintained a precise 2 nautical mile gap, a distance calculated to play tricks on the frigate's radar logic. The lead vessel, Magura 1, was the sacrificial lamb. Its job was to be loud. It didn't try to hide its radar cross-section. Instead, it optimized its angle of approach to be just visible enough to trigger an alert, but not so clear that the ship could get an immediate fire control lock. It was a radar attractor, a digital ghost designed to draw the eyes of every officer on the bridge toward a single point in the fog. Meanwhile, 2 miles back, Magura II was the assassin. It operated in a completely different mode, utilizing a low-power, frequency-hopping communication burst that was nearly impossible to direction find. It hugged the blind zones created by the frigate's own massive superstructure. Every ship has a radar shadow, a sliver of the world that the sensors can't see because the ship's own masts or chimneys are in the way. Magura II lived in that shadow. It was a hunter-killer pairing, where the hunter wasn't even the one doing the killing. In Lviv, the operators were receiving a data feed from a high-altitude NATO intelligence asset, giving them the exact GPS coordinates of the Russian ship. The coordination was surgical. Magura I would dart in, feigning an attack, forcing the Russian captain to swing his guns and sensors toward the bow, while Magura II silently looped around toward the stern. The Russians thought they were fighting one drone. They were actually being flanked by a ghost. The doctrinal spacing meant that even if the lead drone was vaporized, the ship would have no idea that a second, larger threat was already closing in on its most vulnerable point, the unarmored rudder and propeller assemblies. Everything was proceeding with terrifying efficiency until the environment, the one thing neither side could control, intervened. The Arctic is not a laboratory. It is a chaotic, electrically charged nightmare. Without warning, a massive 80-foot iceberg, a growler nearly invisible in the thick fog, appeared directly in the path of the lead drone. The onboard AI, which had been optimized for collision avoidance, suddenly faced a logic loop. If it turned too hard, it would lose its stealth profile. If it didn't, it would be smashed into plastic splinters. In the command center, thousands of miles away, the operator saw the white wall of ice fill the screen and grabbed the manual controls. For 8 heart-stopping seconds, the drone was flown like a racing car, executing a 15-degree power slide through the freezing water, missing the jagged ice by less than 3 feet. The spray from the near miss coated the camera lens in a layer of instant ice, blinding the primary optical sensor. Then, the situation went from bad to catastrophic. At -15 degrees Celsius, the atmosphere itself became a weapon. A phenomenon known as electrically charged sea smoke rolled in, creating a wall of atmospheric interference that choked the Starlink satellite connection. In the Lviv command center, the high-definition video feed suddenly stuttered, turned to static, and then went pitch black. Total silence. For 20 seconds, 2 explosive-laden drones were screaming through the Arctic at 40 knots with no human at the wheel. This is the moment where most missions fail. The drones were effectively blind and deaf. If the Russian ship changed course now, the drones would sail right past them into the void. But the Ukrainians had built in a redundancy that the Russians hadn't anticipated. Orbiting 5 miles above the cloud deck was a Bayraktar TB2. It wasn't there to drop bombs. It was there to act as a UHF relay node. It pinged the drones with a low-frequency signal, bypassing the satellite interference and restoring a grainy, low-bandwidth backup feed, just as the Russian radar finally achieved a hard lock. The mission was back online, but the element of total surprise was gone. On the bridge of the Admiral Grigorovich, the general quarters alarm finally shattered the silence. The radar officer had detected 2 fast-moving, low RCS surface contacts. They weren't ice floes. They were moving at 40 knots, straight for the hull. The Russian captain, realizing the threat was imminent, didn't hold back. He ordered the activation of the Pantsir M air defense system and the AK-630 rotary cannons. But the Russians were panicking. Instead of using point defense weapons, they launched a Kh-35 Uran anti-ship missile from the starboard rail. This was a weapon designed to sink 8,000-ton destroyers. Using it against a 15-foot plastic drone was the definition of overkill, but it was a move born of pure desperation. The Kh-35 screamed off the rail, its seeker head searching for a massive steel target. But the Magura V5 is a ghost made of carbon fiber and specialized coatings. The Ukrainian operator saw the missile launch on the TB2's overhead feed and triggered the evasion protocol. The drone began a violent computer-assisted zigzag maneuver while simultaneously ejecting a custom mini flare canister. The missile, confused by the sudden thermal bloom and the tiny erratic radar return, lost its lock. It plunged into the Arctic Ocean 180 yards off the drone's port side. The resulting explosion was massive, sending a pillar of white water hundreds of feet into the air. The shock wave nearly capsized the Magura, tossing it like a toy, but the low-profile hull design allowed it to self-right and continue its inbound sprint. The Russians fired a second Kh-35, and the result was the same. Another million-dollar missile neutralized by a $50,000 drone and a handful of magnesium flares. Two of Russia's most advanced cruise missiles were now at the bottom of the ocean, and the cheap drones were still coming. The realization started to sink in on the Russian bridge. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were the prey. Recognizing that their long-range missiles were useless against these sea gnats, the Russian captain ordered a hard turn to bring his broadside guns to bear. This was exactly what the Ukrainian operators wanted. As the frigate listed heavily in the turn, exposing its vulnerable side, the lead Murom-1 executed its final distraction maneuver. A deck-mounted release rack on the drone snapped open, and 4 Arctic Wasp FPV drones launched into the freezing air. These weren't large aircraft. They were 5-pound quadcopters with high-explosive shaped charges. They didn't fly high, they hugged the wave tops, flanking the frigate from multiple angles. The Panzer M system, which is one of the most advanced point defense systems in the world, was suddenly faced with a target saturation nightmare. Its logic was optimized to track a small number of high-priority threats, like incoming cruise missiles. Now, it had 6 distinct targets converging from different vectors, 2 boats on the water, and 4 wasps in the air. The radar returns multiplied, and the ship's fire control computer struggled to prioritize. The AK-630 rotary cannons went into fully automatic mode, their 6 barrels spinning up to 5,000 rounds per minute. They managed to shred 2 of the wasps in a hail of 30mm lead, but the sustained firing was too much. After 15 seconds of continuous firing, the portside gun began to smoke. The barrels, overheated by the intense friction in the freezing external air, warped and jammed. While the Russian sailors were frantically trying to clear the jam and swatting at the remaining wasps with shoulder-fired Igla missiles, they completely lost track of the water. Mura II, the silent assassin, had used the chaos to slip into the stern's radar shadow. The wasps didn't need to sink the ship, they just needed to make the Russians look the wrong way, and it worked perfectly. By the time an aft lookout spotted the white wake of Mura II and screamed a warning, it was already too late. The ship's primary guns were pointing forward, and the stern was wide open. But the Arctic had one last complication for the Ukrainians. As Mura II made its final turn for the rudder, the electrically charged fog returned with a vengeance, severing the Starlink feed entirely. The screens in Lviv went black again. This time, there was no time for a relay. The drone was less than a mile out and moving at 45 knots. The operator had only one choice. He deployed the precursor. From the back of Mura II, a specialized fiber optic FPV drone launched. Unlike the other drones, this one didn't rely on satellites or radio waves. It trailed a physical spool of glass fiber, a literal tether to the mother drone. It was 100% immune to Russian electronic warfare. Through this hardwired connection, a grainy but stable video feed returned to the operator's goggles. He saw the Russian sailors scrambling on the aft deck, the red alarm strobes reflecting off the ice-coated railings, and the frantic attempts to bring a heavy machine gun to bear. The fiber-optic drone didn't aim for the hull, it aimed for the steering. It dove directly into the rudder assembly and the exposed propeller shafts. The 2-pound shaped charge was small, but its placement was surgical. It severed the hydraulic steering linkages instantly. On the bridge, the helmsman felt the wheel go limp. The 4,000-ton frigate began to drift, its momentum carrying it into a slow, uncontrollable circle. It was a mission kill. The ship was now a stationary target in the middle of a shooting gallery. The captain ordered all remaining guns to fire manually, the tracers walking across the water, splashing within feet of Mura 2. But the operator overrode the AI safety limits, forcing the boat into violent snake maneuvers that defied the physics of the water. The distance counter on the screen collapsed. 400 yards, 200 yards, 100 yards. The stern of the Grigorovich filled the entire frame. The last intercepted radio traffic from the ship was a single panicked command: brace for impact. At 0415 Zulu, the Magura V5 struck the hull just below the waterline at a speed of 45 knots. The 660-pound payload of RDX didn't just blow a hole in the ship, it created a phenomenon known as a bubble pulse. The explosion underwater created a massive gas bubble that expanded and collapsed in milliseconds, sending a pressure spike of over 10,000 pounds per square inch through the ship's structure. The hull, made brittle by the sub-zero Arctic temperatures, didn't bend, it fractured. The shock wave traveled through the keel like a hammer blow, snapping internal bulkheads and triggering a secondary detonation in the ship's forward missile magazine. A massive fireball, orange and violent, erupted 300 feet into the black Arctic sky, briefly turning the night into day. The Admiral Grigorovich, a $500 million symbol of Russian naval power, rolled 45 degrees to the port side in seconds. Water flooded the engine spaces, and the massive turbines, choked by the sea, groaned and died. In 8 minutes, the ship was gone, leaving nothing behind but a patch of burning oil and a few bobbing pieces of debris in the freezing slush. But the impact of the sinking went far beyond the ocean floor. Ukraine had just demonstrated that the entire concept of a safe harbor was dead. Using 2 shipping containers and a handful of low-cost drones, they had shattered Russia's Arctic strategy. They proved that no matter where a Russian ship hides, be it the Black Sea, the Baltic, or the furthest reaches of the North Pole, the receipt will be delivered. This is the new math of naval warfare. You can spend $500 million on a ship, but it only takes $50,000 of trash to send it to the bottom. The Arctic was supposed to be a sanctuary. Now it's just a graveyard.